The skies over Berlin held secrets that still whisper in my ears. Joe Mccallister, B-17 Flying Fortress pilot. Among all the dangerous missions I flew during the bombing campaign over Germany, there's one that redefined my perspective on war. It was January 1944, and I was commanding a crew of 9 men in the 305th Bombardment Group. Our aircraft, affectionately nicknamed Lady Liberty, had already completed 23 successful missions. The trust between us was absolute. Each man knew his role as if it were a natural extension of his own body. The night before the mission, I received my orders from command. Our squadron was to bomb a crucial arms factory in the heart of Berlin. The briefing was tense. Intelligence reports indicated that the German anti-aircraft defense had been significantly strengthened. The Luftwaffe was determined to protect the capital of the Reich at any cost. My crew was exceptional. Frank Morrison, my co-pilot, had nerves of steel and a sense of humor that kept us sane in the worst situations. The navigator, Robert Doc Thompson, was a genius with maps and calculations. In the bomber compartment, Michael O'Brien had the precision of a surgeon. The gunners Peterson, Rodriguez, Collins, Weber, and Anderson were the best I've ever met. We took off before dawn from our base in Chelston, England. The formation of B-17s filled the sky like a metallic swarm, each aircraft carrying its lethal load. The synchronized sound of the Wright Cyclone engines was our private symphony, a melody that still echoes in my dreams. The first part of the flight was uneventful. We crossed the English Channel under the protection of P-51 Mustang fighters, which would escort us as far as their fuel would allow. Doc kept a watchful eye on our navigation, while Frank monitored the instruments with his usual efficiency. It was over German territory that hell broke loose. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire exploded close to our left wing, causing Lady Liberty to shudder violently. "Flak at 3 o'clock," shouted Peterson over the intercom. The black shrapnel from the anti-aircraft explosions began to dot the sky around us like a deadly rain. The formation began to disperse under the intense enemy fire. Through the breeze, I saw B-17 in front of us take a direct hit. The aircraft tilted grotesquely before plunging into a deadly spiral. I forced myself to stay focused on our mission, and there was no time to mourn. "Bandits at 12 o'clock high." Collins' tense voice cut through the air. A squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s emerged from the clouds, their machine guns spitting death. Rodriguez and Weber responded immediately with our .50s, the deafening sound of the guns reverberating through the fuselage. I maneuvered the Lady Liberty through the curtain of fire, feeling every movement of the stick as if it were an extension of my own body. Frank helped with the controls, compensating when necessary. The synchronicity between us was vital. A single mistake could be fatal. 5 minutes to target, Doc announced, his voice maintaining a professional calm that contradicted the chaotic situation around us. O'Brien was already in position in the bomber compartment. His precise calculations would be crucial to the success of the mission. A violent impact shook the aircraft. "Damage to Engine 3, reported Frank, his eyes fixed on the gauges which were rapidly indicating a loss of power. The acrid smell of fuel began to permeate the cabin, but we couldn't aboard. We were too close to the target. "Prepare to bomb," I ordered, keeping Lady Liberty as stable as possible despite the damaged engine. The sky over Berlin was an inferno of explosions and tracers, a macabre dance of light and death. Through the smoke and chaos, I could make out our objective below. "Bomber open," O'Brien's voice sounded clear and determined. For the next few seconds, which seemed like an eternity, I maintained our unwavering course, ignoring the intensifying enemy fire. Precision was key. Lives depended on it, both in the air and on the ground. This was just the beginning of a mission that would test the limits of our courage and skill. The real challenge was yet to come, and every man on board Lady Liberty knew that our chances of returning depended not only on our individual expertise, but on our ability to function as a cohesive unit under the most extreme circumstances. "Bombs away," announced O'Brien, and I felt the Lady Liberty grow lighter as our deadly cargo descended towards the target. Through the thick smoke, I could see the flashes of the explosions hitting the armaments factory. Our primary mission was accomplished, But we still had to return home, and that would possibly be the biggest challenge. The damaged engine began to fail more intensely, and Frank struggled to keep our instruments stable. "Joe, we're gradually losing altitude," he informed us, his voice tense but controlled. I knew that every meter of altitude lost made us easier targets for anti-aircraft artillery. "Formation of Me-109's approaching," Anderson's voice sounded over the intercom. Immediately, I ordered an evasive maneuver, tilting Lady Liberty at a steep angle to avoid the frontal attack. The sound of our aircraft's .50 machine guns mingled with the roar of the engines and the surrounding explosions. Doc kept a close eye on our navigation, crucial now that we needed to find an alternative route back. "I suggest course 270, Captain. There's less concentration of anti-aircraft batteries in that direction," he recommended. I trusted his judgment. Doc had never let us down. A violent impact shook our aircraft again. "We're being hit in the stabilizer," shouted Colin from the top tower. Frank and I struggled with the controls, which were getting heavier and heavier. The B-17 was known for its endurance, but every aircraft had its limits. Rodriguez, our side gunner, managed to shoot down one of the Me-109s that was chasing us. "We got one," his voice conveyed both relief and determination. But there was no time to celebrate. 2 more German fighters were still on our tail. The fuel was starting to run down more quickly than usual, probably due to the damage we had sustained. "Engine 4 is overheating," Frank warned, his eyes fixed on the gauges. We had to reduce power to avoid a catastrophic failure. "More flak ahead," Peterson warned. The sky was literally black with anti-aircraft explosions. I tried to maintain our altitude, but with 2 engines compromised, it was a losing battle. We began to lose height constantly. At that moment, a radio communication brought a glimmer of hope. "This is Mustang Leader, we're coming into cover." P-51s, our guardian angels, had returned after refueling, and it couldn't have been at a more crucial moment. The German fighters were forced to disperse with the arrival of our escort. I took the opportunity to start a controlled descent. We had no choice but to fly lower to save the engines that were still running. Oil temperature rising on Engine 2. Frank kept monitoring our increasingly precarious situation. O'Brien, who had returned to his post as gunner after the bombing, kept a constant eye on our rear. The vibration of the aircraft increased by the minute, and I could feel that Lady Liberty was on edge. But she was our faithful companion, having brought us back from so many impossible missions. We needed to trust her once again. "Dutch coast in sight," Doc announced after what seemed like an eternity. The news brought a brief moment of relief to the crew, but we still had the North Sea to cross. With our engines in critical condition, it would be our last and greatest test. Weber reported significant damage to our right wing, where shards of flak had pierced the control surface. Every movement of the stick required more force, and Frank had to constantly help me to maintain control of the aircraft. "How much fuel?" I asked Frank, dreading the answer. "Less than 20 minutes in the main tanks," he replied, his voice deeper than usual. We all knew what that meant. It would be close. The English coast never seemed so far away. Every mile was a battle against gravity and time. Lady Liberty moaned and vibrated, but kept flying, as if she understood the vital importance of completing this last stage. Base calling Lady Liberty. The familiar voice of our control tower finally cut through the air. "We have you on radar. Preparing runway for emergency landing." I never thought I'd be so happy to hear the metallic voice over the radio. The crew remained absolutely silent during our final approach. Each man prayed in his own way, not just for our lives, but for Lady Liberty, who had endured so much to bring us back. English soil was approaching, and with it, our last chance of survival. Our mission in Berlin had been accomplished, but the price had been high. As we prepared for the most challenging landing of our lives, I reflected on each man on board, their courage, their dedication, their mutual trust. That was what kept us alive, more than any individual skill or advanced technology. The emergency landing was one of the most critical moments of my flying career. With only 2 engines running precariously and the controls becoming less and less responsive, it took all my experience and a lot of luck to get Lady Liberty back on the ground. Landing gear jammed. Frank confirmed as we approached the runway. Our tires hit the tarmac with a violent impact, and I struggled with all my might to keep the aircraft aligned. The B-17 skidded dangerously before finally coming to a stop, leaving a trail of smoke and twisted metal behind it. When the engines finally fell silent, a surreal stillness overtook the cabin. For a few seconds, no one moved, as if we needed to process the fact that we had actually survived. It was Peterson who broke the silence. "I think I'm going to need to change my pants." The nervous laughter that followed was interrupted by the arrival of emergency vehicles. While the firemen poured foam over our smoking engines, I did a quick inspection of the crew. We had some minor injuries, mainly cuts caused by shrapnel, but we were all alive. A miracle considering what we had faced. Lady Liberty, however, was in critical condition. When I got off the aircraft, I could see the true extent of the damage. Dozens of punctures all over the fuselage, one of the propellers completely destroyed, and part of the tail practically ripped off. Our faithful companion had given her all to bring us back. In the debriefing that followed, we discovered that only 7 of the 12 aircraft in our formation had returned. The cruel reality of war hit us like a punch in the stomach from friends and colleagues we would never see again. Faces that would join the many others that already haunted our nights. "Mission successfully accomplished," declared Colonel Harrison, showing the reconnaissance photos. The armaments factory had been completely destroyed. But while others celebrated, I could only think of the human cost of that victory. That evening, our crew gathered at the local pub, a tradition after every mission. O'Brien raised his glass. "To Lady Liberty." The toast was repeated in unison, but there was a sobriety in our voices that went beyond the usual respect. Doc, always the most contemplative of the group, commented quietly, "You know, I saw something different in Berlin today. The city is changing. The Germans are losing this war, but they haven't realized it yet." He was right. Intelligence reports indicated that the Reich was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. Frank, who rarely spoke about his emotions, confessed, "For a moment, when that second engine started to fail, I thought we wouldn't make it. But you, Joe, kept your cool. As always." I shook my head, knowing that it was the joint effort of the whole crew that had saved us. Rodriguez and Weber were animatedly discussing their clashes with the German fighters, their hands drawing trajectories in the air. Collins, still with a bandage on his forehead, listened attentively as he swirled his glass distractedly. Anderson, normally the most talkative, was unusually quiet, lost in his own thoughts. "How long until Lady Liberty flies again?" asked Peterson, the question we all avoided asking. "Weeks, maybe months," I replied, "if it can be repaired." The idea of flying in another aircraft seemed like a betrayal of our wounded companion. But the war wouldn't wait. In a few days, we would receive orders for a new mission, probably in another B-17. The strategic bombing campaign continued, and every aircraft, every crew, every mission was vital to the war effort. Watching my men that night, I realized that something had changed. The mission in Berlin had transformed us in subtle but profound ways. We were the same men, but we now carried a new weight, the intimate knowledge of our own mortality and an understanding of the true meaning of trust and sacrifice. The distant sound of aircraft engines made us look up at another squadron leaving for a night mission. We followed its sound until it disappeared into the darkness, each of us silently wishing them the same luck as we had today. In the days following our dramatic mission to Berlin, I realized that the deepest scars were not those visible on Lady Liberty's fuselage. Each crew member processed the events of that day differently, and as commander, I felt responsible not only for their lives but also for their mental well-being. Frank started checking the flight instruments obsessively before every takeoff in our new aircraft, a B-17G we nicknamed Second Chance. Doc Thompson developed the habit of carrying around a small notebook in which he meticulously wrote down every detail of the escape routes he planned, as if preparing for the inevitable moment when we would need them again. One morning, I found O'Brien alone in the hangar, staring at the bomber compartment. "Sometimes I wonder about that factory," he said, without looking away. "How many were down there when the bombs fell?" There was no answer I could offer that would ease that burden. Our new mission's routine continued, but something had fundamentally changed in our dynamic. The trust was still there, stronger than ever perhaps, forged in the fire of that mission in Berlin. But there was also a new sobriety in our interactions, a deeper understanding of the fragility of life. Rodriguez and Weber developed an almost telepathic communication system during the fighting, their .50 machine guns synchronized as if operated by a single mind. Peterson began to keep a detailed diary of each mission, so that someone will know what happened here, he explained, in case we don't come back. One afternoon, after a particularly tense mission over the Ruhr, Collins sought me out in the officer's lounge. "Captain," he began hesitantly, "that B-17 we saw crash in Berlin. That was the lucky strike, wasn't it?" I confirmed with a nod. "Did you know anyone on the crew?" "My cousin was on board," he replied simply before leaving. Anderson, always the youngest of the group, seemed to have aged years in those few weeks. His usual jokes had been replaced by a darker, more cynical humor. "Do you know what the difference is between us and the Germans down there?" he once asked during a briefing. "About 20,000 feet. The missions kept coming deeper and deeper into enemy territory. The war was changing, we could feel it. Intelligence reports showed an increasingly desperate Germany, making every flight even more dangerous. The Luftwaffe may have been losing the war, but its pilots were fighting with the ferocity of men who had nothing to lose. During a mission over Dresden, we faced a new enemy tactic. Me-262s, the new German jet fighters, attacked our formation with impressive speed. "I've never seen anything so fast," exclaimed Weber over the intercom, as his blast tried futilely to keep up with the jets that passed us by like metallic ghosts. Lady Liberty remained under repair, and every time we passed the hangar where she rested, I noticed how my men looked at her with a mixture of longing and respect. It was more than an aircraft, it was a symbol of our survival, of our unity as a crew. The European winter made each mission an additional challenge. The intense cold froze the mechanisms of the machine guns, and the low clouds made navigation as difficult as accurate bombing. Doc started carrying a Catholic rosary along with his navigation charts. "It doesn't hurt to have extra help," he said with a shy smile. One evening, after returning from a mission over Hamburg, I found Frank still in the cockpit, motionless, staring at the dark horizon. "You know, Joe," he said without turning around, "after Berlin, every return is like a gift. Every safe landing is a miracle." I understood perfectly what he meant. The war was changing all of us, in ways we wouldn't fully understand until years later. Each mission added a new layer to our experience, a new weight to our souls. But it also strengthened the bonds between us, creating a brotherhood that transcended ranks and origins. Our crew became known in the squadron for their quiet efficiency. We weren't the loudest in the pub or the ones who told the most extraordinary stories, but we were respected. Newcomers came to us for advice, and the veterans recognized in our eyes the same look that carried the gaze of those who had faced hell and returned to tell the tale. With Lady Liberty still under repair and Second Chance as our new home in the air, the missions kept coming. But nothing compared to that day in Berlin. Each subsequent flight seemed to carry the weight of that experience, like a ghost following us through the skies of Europe. One afternoon, after returning from a mission over the Ruhr Valley, I received news that shook our crew. The Lady Liberty had been declared irreparable. The structural damage was too extensive. Frank found me watching our old companion in the hangar. "Looks like we're saying goodbye to an old friend," he commented, his voice laden with restrained emotion. The entire crew had gathered that night for a kind of silent vigil. Each of us owed our lives to that aircraft. Command was stepping up operations. Intelligence reports indicated that Germany was on the verge of collapse, but paradoxically, this made our missions even more dangerous. Nazi desperation was translating into increasingly daring and unpredictable tactics. During one particularly tense briefing, Doc identified a pattern in recent loss reports. "The Germans are concentrating their defenses on specific routes," he explained, pointing to his map covered in notes. "They're forcing us to fly along predetermined corridors." This information proved vital during our next mission. Approaching a target in Munich, I identified the trap that awaited us, an abnormal concentration of anti-aircraft batteries, exactly where they would expect us to fly. We decided to risk an alternative route, longer but less defended. Fuel critical, warned Frank when we finally reached the target. O'Brien had only one chance to bomb, and he didn't waste it. Later photos would confirm a direct hit on the bearing factory, crucial for the production of German tanks. The return was a nightmare of calculations and fuel economy. Peterson kept a constant eye on the meter, while Rodriguez and Weber took turns with the machine guns, saving ammunition for only the most critical threats. "Captain," Colin's voice sounded tense over the intercom. "We have a group of Me-262s approaching." The new German jets were a threat we were still learning to deal with. Their superior speed rendered traditional defense tactics almost useless. Anderson managed to hit one of the jets with a precise burst, proving that even these advanced machines were not invulnerable. "For someone so fast, they burn like anyone else," he commented, but his voice didn't carry the usual humor. The war was changing rapidly around us. The German cities we flew over were showing more and more signs of total destruction. O'Brien, always sensitive, began to focus exclusively on military and industrial targets, refusing to consider any adjustments that might hit civilian areas. Our crew had become an even more cohesive unit after Berlin. Each man knew not only his role, but also how to support the others at critical moments. It was this synchronicity that kept us going, mission after mission. "Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever come back here in peacetime," Doc reflected during a particularly quiet return flight. The idea seemed surreal. Would these same cities we were bombing one day be tourist destinations? Exhaustion was taking its toll. I noticed deeper circles under my men's eyes, subtle tremors in their hands during briefings. But no one asked to be excused, no one backed down. We had come too far to give up now. Frank developed a ritual before each takeoff. 3 gentle taps on the instrument panel, a silent nod to the photo of his family pinned to the side of the altimeter. Small gestures that helped us maintain our humanity in the midst of chaos. One morning, we received the news that the war in Europe was coming to an end. The Russians were advancing from the east, while our forces were pressing from the west. But for our crew, every mission was still a battle for survival. "Don't let your guard down," I warned during a briefing. "The most dangerous moments are those when you start to think you're safe." The crew nodded in understanding. We had learned that lesson the hard way in Berlin. Second Chance would never be Lady Liberty, but she had her own qualities. Newer, faster, with improved defensive systems. Still, we all knew that it wasn't just the aircraft that mattered, it was the crew that flew it. The war was coming to an end, but for our crew, every mission still carried the weight of that experience in Berlin. Second Chance had proved to be a reliable aircraft, but we all knew that it would never completely replace Lady Liberty in our hearts. Our last mission came in April 1945. The objective was a U-boat base in Kiel, one of the last significant strongholds of the German resistance. During the briefing, I noticed how each member of the crew absorbed the information with the same intensity as always. The war might be over, but the danger remained real. "This will be our last dance, boys," I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. Frank, my faithful co-pilot, just nodded, his eyes revealing a mixture of relief and apprehension. Doc Thompson was studying his maps with the same meticulous dedication as always, plotting alternative routes as he had done since Berlin. The takeoff was routine, but there was something different in the air. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this would be our last mission together, or maybe it was just the accumulated weight of all the experiences we had shared. O'Brien checked his equipment 3 times, a habit he developed after our experience in Berlin. "Formation complete," reported Peterson from the tower. Our squadron had been reduced since those early days, and many crews hadn't been as lucky as us. Rodriguez and Weber held their positions on the side machine guns, their movements synchronized after so many missions together. Flying over the North Sea, Collins broke the usual silence. "Do you remember the first time we flew together?" The question triggered a series of shared memories, moments that transformed us from a simple crew into a family. The approach to Kiel was surprisingly smooth. The once feared Luftwaffe was practically non-existent. Even so, we maintained our vigilance, having learned the hard way that complacency was deadly. "Flak at 3 o'clock, Anderson warned, his voice carrying the same tension as always. The anti-aircraft explosion seemed more sparse now, but no less lethal. I held our formation steady, remembering the lessons learned on each previous mission. O'Brien prepared for the bombardment with his characteristic precision. Bomber open, his voice rang out clearly over the intercom. At that moment, every man on board knew exactly what to do, a well-rehearsed symphony of movements and decisions. The bombs found their target with devastating precision. Through the smoke, we could see the underwater installations crumbling. But there was no joy in our victory, only the sobering realization that every mission, however necessary, carried a human cost. Our return was marked by an uneasy calm. Frank kept his eyes fixed on the instruments, as he always did, but I noticed that occasionally his gaze wandered to the horizon. Doc made extra navigational calculations, a habit that saved our lives more than once. "Allied territory ahead," Doc announced after what seemed like an eternity. A collective sigh of relief went through the aircraft. Our last mission was coming to an end, but the weight of our experiences would remain with us forever. The landing was smooth, a final courtesy from Second Chance. As the engines fell silent, we remained at our posts for an extra moment, each absorbing the reality that this was truly our last mission together. In the briefing room, Colonel Harrison congratulated us on the successful mission, but his words seemed distant. I looked at my crew, these men who had become more than subordinates, more than friends. We could see on each face the marks left by Berlin, by each mission, by each moment of terror and triumph shared. "You know," said O'Brien as we left the room, "I don't think I'll ever see a team like this again." He was right. What we had built together, trust, synchronicity, mutual understanding, was something rare and precious. That evening, our last night as a crew, we gathered in the local pub. Stories flowed freely not only of our missions, but of our lives before the war, of our dreams for the future. Frank finally showed us the photo of his family that he always carried in the cockpit. Doc shared his plans to return to university. Rodriguez and Weber planned to open a business together after the war, their partnership on the machine guns evolving into a lifelong friendship. Collins talked about his cousin lost in Berlin and for the first time allowed himself to cry openly. Anderson, our youngest gunner, seemed to have aged years during our journey. "I never thought I'd miss this," he confessed, "but I think I'll miss you all." Peterson raised his glass in a final toast. "To Lady Liberty, Second Chance, and the best damn crew that ever flew." There were no dry eyes at the table when the glasses met. As I watched my men that last night, I realized that the war had changed us in ways we were only beginning to understand. But it had also given us something precious, a bond forged in the fire of combat, tempered by mutual trust and solidified by experiences that only we could truly understand. The war would officially end a few weeks later, but for our crew, it ended that night in the pub, with stories, tears, and the certainty that, no matter where life took us, we would always be the crew that survived Berlin.